for joining our second internal but also external training opportunity as it relates to updates to Kitsap County Code Title 12, which is stormwater drainage, as well as the associated stormwater design manual. After a multi-year update process, these changes do go into effect next week on October 4th, which is a Monday. So just a heads up there, but this is also an opportunity to get awareness of what those changes are specifically, but also example exercises and how to apply those changes to projects, whether public or private. And also here with me, I'm Angie Silva. I'm one of 2 assistant directors with Kitsap County, who oversees development engineering review services. But this effort could not be possible without a team that crosses both the Department of Community Development, but also Public Works. So here to assist everyone is Sean O'Leary from Kitsap County Department of Public Works, Stormwater Utility, Michelle Purdue from also the Stormwater Utility, Robin Kirschbaum, which is an amazing consultant who has assisted us in this effort, as well as Rebecca, and I'm going to butcher this name, so Dugo Polowski, also from Herrera, who has assisted the update process. And last but not least, Jeffrey Meck, who's the Department of Community Development Director, is also here with us, who has a background in stormwater review as he went through the ranks within the department itself. Next slide, Kim. So again, this was a multi-year effort that originally started in 2019 with a lot of different outreach points and input points from industry professionals, associations, as well as review before the Kitsap County Planning Commission and final decision before the Kitsap County Board of County Commissioners, which again took action on June 28th of this year with proposed changes to go into effect again October 4th.
All right, thank you, Angie. I'll go ahead and take over the first part of the training here. As Angie mentioned, my name is Rebecca Dugopolsky. I'm with Herrera and was part of the consultant team working on this effort. So I want to start off by providing an overview of what we'll be talking about today, starting off with a summary of Ecology's updates, the Washington State Department of Ecology, so kind of the driver behind why the Kitsap Code and Manual were updated. And then we'll run through a brief summary of some of the key changes in the Kitsap Stormwater Design Manual. We'll take a look at the online manual. We sent out a link prior to the training, and I'll go ahead and post that in the chat now as well. So you could take a look at that as we get into the exercises today. And that will be posted on the county's website eventually. So the link that we're sharing today is just a temporary link to help you with the exercises and take a look at what the online version of the manual looks like. We'll also have a couple of breakout exercises that we'll be doing in small groups. And after the training, we will be sharing these PowerPoint slides and the exercise answer key. And we'll also be sharing the recording of this training that we're doing today. So I just posted the link to the online training, and I'll go ahead and post the packet shortly as well, so you can take a look at that. Those were sent out prior to the training, so feel free to look at your email from Kim with that information, or pull it from the chat if you don't have that in front of you. Some of the rules of engagement for today's training. If you could go ahead and keep your audio on mute when you're not speaking. We're asking everyone to basically keep that on mute until we get into our breakout exercises. And then of course, we want you to be discussing things within your small groups. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A portion as well. So feel free to speak up during that portion of the training. The raise hand feature you can also use during the Q&A portion at the end if you have questions. As this early part of the presentation, if you want to just type any questions you have in the chat, we'll go ahead and either address those as we go through the slides if it's a minor clarification issue, or we'll go ahead and hold those to the end for the Q&A. But if something comes up, feel free to type that into chat before you lose that, and we'll get to that at the appropriate time. As Kim mentioned and Angie mentioned, this is a public meeting and is being audio and video recorded. So that notification popped up already, but just wanted to give everyone a heads up that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the county's webpage after the training. All right, we'll go ahead and launch our first polling question. What is your favorite body of water? Should be popping up on your screen. All right, so answers are in. It looks like the winner is Hood Canal, with followed up by Dyes Inlet, Sinclair Inlet, and Liberty Bay. So out of those choices, it looks like Hood Canal is the winner. All right, so next I'll talk a little bit about the updates to the Washington State Department of Ecology manual, which is, as I mentioned, the driver behind the updates to the county's manual. So in 2019, Department of Ecology came out with a new stormwater management manual for Western Washington. There were some usability enhancements associated with that. So they have an online version of the ecology manual as well, which is using the same format that the Kitsap County manual is using. Madcap Flare is the name of the software to navigate through that manual. Ecology did quite a bit of consolidation, clarification, reorganization. So if you're familiar with the 2014 manual, things did shuffle around a little bit. There were also some updates to technical information contained in that, such as updates to continuous simulation modeling requirements, incorporation of the Van Ganutian algorithm and WHM for modeling bioretention, and also updates to the replaced hard surface redevelopment threshold and equivalent area definitions. Some additional updates included updates to minimum requirements number 2, 5, and 7. Those include the construction requirements, the flow control requirements, and the on-site stormwater management requirements. So minimum requirement 2 was updated to incorporate changes that were made to the construction stormwater general permit. Minimum requirement 5 was updated to require soil quality and depth BMP when choosing to use the LAD performance standard. And minimum requirement 7, the flow control requirement, was updated to ensure that threshold discharge areas discharging to marine water body meets all exemption requirements before it could be determined to be flow control exempt. There were also updates to the concrete washout BMPs, both for concrete handling and concrete washout areas, some clarifications there. Incorporation of some additional source control BMPs. So there's 17 total new source control BMPs, 4 of which were previously included in one BMP that was focused on landscaping and lawn vegetation management, but the rest are new BMPs that are also referenced in the Kitsap County manual. And then some updated wetland guidance focused on just a change to how the requirements are applied. So there's some new information on how wetland guidance is applied and expanded guidance for regional facilities as well as incorporation of underground injection control program guidance. So those were some of the key updates to the ecology manual. So shifting next into the Kitsap County Stormwater Design Manual, you'll notice that it's the same structure as the previous Kitsap County manual. So we still have 2 volumes. Volume 1 contains 4 chapters and volume 2 contains 9 chapters. So that structure is the same as the previous manual. So you'll notice the same format. And Angie mentioned already that the effective date is coming up on Monday, so October 4th. There are several manuals referenced within the Kitsap County manual, so I just wanted to point these out, that there are several manuals that should be used in conjunction with the Kitsap County manual, and they're listed here. These show up both in Volume 1, Section 1.2, as well as Volume 2, Section 5.2. So that includes the Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington that we've been talking about, or the Ecology Manual, the Western Washington Low Impact Development O&M document, LAD Technical Guidance for Puget Sound, and both the WashDOT Highway Runoff Manual and Hydraulics Manual, and then the Rain Garden Handbook for Western Washington. So those are some other useful design manuals that should be used in conjunction with the Kitsap County Manual. All right, we're ready for polling question number 2. This one's focused on what sector you're from, and this will just help us understand who's in the room today and help us focus a little bit of our discussion around the breakout exercises. All right, great. So results are in. We've got mainly folks from government, followed by consulting, and then a couple in the trades and 1 student and a few others. So that's great. So we've got mainly local government folks in the room today and consultants. All right, so next I'm going to highlight, as I mentioned, the Kitsap SDM is shifted to an online manual format. Some of the benefits of this include a dynamic table of contents, Ease of navigation, so there's hyperlinks to relevant content, easily to navigate around the manual. Some enhanced search capabilities, and also downloads. So you can download a full PDF of the manual, native CAD files, etc. So I'll go ahead and show that, or you can click on that link that I provided in the chat. So here's what the manual looks like. And you can click through these items here. So you'll notice each of the chapters has these drop-down menus, or you can click on these links. It's this dynamic table of contents to help go through the manual. And at the bottom, you can see these navigation arrows as well. Enhanced search, there's search terms, search filters, etc. So you could take a look at those, and we'll be looking at that as part of one of our breakout exercises today. And then also the downloads page, where you can download the full PDF of the manual, PDF of all the figures, and then you can download the CAD figures as well, standard plan notes, the Appendix C site assessment and planning packet, and also notes related to construction site sediment transport potential. So there's lots of great information here, and hopefully it's easier to navigate around and easier to search for content. So definitely take a look at that, and take a look at the new structure and the online manual. All right, so next I'm going to focus on some of the key changes in Volume 1 of the manual. So this slide just highlights some of the key changes I'll be talking about today. So step 8 has been added to the process for determining minimum requirements, and that's delineating threshold discharge areas. We'll be talking about that. Updates to the minimum requirement flowcharts, and then updates to minimum requirements 2, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for consistency with ecology. So in chapter 3 of volume 1, there used to be a 7-step approach to determining minimum requirements. And as I mentioned, this step 8 is new. There were some minor changes to step 7 as well, but the process steps 1 through 6 is the same. So now there's step 7 has been revised to include review for critical drainage areas. And then step 8 has been added, since we're adding some information about threshold discharge areas, and we'll be talking about that pretty extensively today. So the new step 8 includes delineating threshold discharge areas within the site, if applicable. So this won't be applicable to all sites. So you can use threshold discharge areas if you would like to in rural areas outside the urban area and urban growth area, on residential sites that are 5 acres or greater. And for each minimum requirement applicable to the project, take a look at the TDA thresholds to determine which BMPs may be constructed. So there's specific information on those in minimum requirements 6, 7, and 8. Minimum requirements 1 through 5 and 9 do not have separate threshold discharge area thresholds and must be applied to the entire project. And implementing a threshold discharge area approach requires downstream analysis and could require other technical analysis depending on site conditions, and that could include geotechnical analysis or critical drainage area evaluation. So you may be asking, what is a threshold discharge area? So some of you are probably familiar with this from the Ecology manual, but the definition here is the area within a project site draining to a single natural discharge location or multiple natural discharge locations that combine within 1/4 mile downstream. And here's just a graphic showing TDAs. And as I mentioned, they may be applicable for rural, outside the UA and UGA residential sites that are 5 acres or greater. And this can be found in the glossary of the manual. So you can find that here under Appendix A, letter T, and here you go, threshold discharge area. And another thing to note here is an area within a project site draining to a single natural discharge location or multiple natural discharge locations that combine within 1/4 mile downstream as determined by the shortest flow path. And we'll be looking at that as part of one of the breakout exercises today. So next, shifting into some of the flow charts, looking first at figure 1-4.1. This is a flow chart for determining minimum requirements for new development projects. Only minor changes were made to this flow chart. You may understand that terminology has been updated from project to site. So some of the terminology here has been updated for consistency with ecology. We also added some clarification in the second footnote here that this applies this box here applies to census defined urban areas and urban growth areas only and does not apply to rural projects. Figure 1-4.2, which is focusing on redevelopment projects. There's several changes here that are highlighted in these red boxes. Again, the terminology was updated from project to site, updated the minimum requirements threshold for non-road related commercial or industrial redevelopment projects to require a comparison of the value of the proposed improvements to the value of the project site improvements rather than the site. This is for consistency with the 2019 Ecology Manual. And then this recommended guidance that popped up here, this is not included in the manual, but looking at what those values might be, you could take a look at the Kitsap County Assessor database to determine the base value. And then you could also use the building code value for improvements. For the minimum requirements themselves, I mentioned that these were updated for consistency with ecology. Minimum requirement 2, as I mentioned, that was updated for consistency with the updated construction stormwater general permit. There were also revisions to several of the 13 elements, so they're all listed here. So there's pretty minor changes throughout, but those were for consistency with ecology. We'll be focusing on 5, 6, and 7 a little bit more today. So we're looking at updates to some of the tables, adding language for threshold discharge areas, and we'll be going over these in more detail. And then also wanted to highlight minimum requirement 8 related to wetlands, added language for threshold discharge areas, and updated references to the Ecology Manual and the Kitsap County Critical Areas Ordinance. This first table here is table 1-4.2. It summarizes the on-site stormwater management requirements, minimum requirement 5 for large projects. This table didn't have any significant changes since the 2016 Kitsap Manual. Just a couple things to clarify here is full dispersion used to be listed as a requirement for new development or redevelopment outside the UGA and urban area, added references to rural areas, and consistency with table 4.3 revisions in terms of the terminology used for the lists, which we'll be looking at in a minute. So this table here, 1-4.3, summarizes the list approach for minimum requirement number 5 compliance. This is not necessarily a new requirement, but it's a new format. So you may have noticed in the previous manual, it was several pages of text, and we've now consolidated this into a single table to make it easier to walk through for the different types of projects. So here, no change to list 1 for small projects. List 2 and list 3 in the 2016 manual were merged into this new list 2. And then list 3 was kind of in there previously, but tucked into text. So this is highlighted a bit better here in terms of what is required for flow control exempt projects. And another thing to note here, a note that got added for permeable pavements is that those are not required for rural residential areas. The next flow chart we wanted to highlight here was related to the flow chart for determining minimum requirement number 5 requirements. This is figure 1-4.3. So here, the new thing that got added here was this box in the upper left corner, asking if the entire project qualifies as flow control exempt, and then you follow a certain process. So this box is new in the upper left. But the rest is essentially the same, except for the list numbers have been updated for consistency with the new list organization. This slide summarizes the approach for flow control exempt projects. As I mentioned, it's the same as the 2016 Stormwater Design Manual, but was shifted forward in the 2021 Stormwater Design Manual for clarity. And there is some new content here added related to threshold discharge areas and how those apply to these types of projects. So if your project has multiple threshold discharge areas, then all threshold discharge areas must be flow control exempt per minimum requirement 7 for the project to use these options. So something to think about there. Everything has to be flow control exempt if you want to move forward with that approach. Minimum requirement 6 is runoff treatment, as I mentioned as well. Language got added to that for threshold discharge areas, taking a look at what the thresholds are and how those are applied. And then also minimum requirement 7. We clarified the text under the exemptions, updated to require a 15-minute time step for evaluating the increase in the 100-year flow, and that's for consistency with the Ecology Manual. and then adding the following threshold discharge area thresholds. So flow control BMPs are required if the following bullets are met here. So taking a look at what those thresholds are and where those apply. All right, so that wraps up my key changes to volume 1. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but feel free to pop those in there. We can get to those during the Q&A if you have any questions on the volume 1 key changes. And with that, Robin, are you ready to start sharing?
I am ready.
All right, you took over already.
In fact, are you seeing my screen right now?
We are. It looks like you're on
All right,
Appendix
let me
H.
get set up in slideshow format and I'll be right there. And lastly, can you confirm you're seeing the slides but not my notes?
Seeing both right now.
Okay.
And it looks like you're also on Appendix H slide.
Yeah, I don't know why that happened. And there we are. All right, everybody. So we are going to go ahead and do our first breakout exercise. So this exercise is relating to threshold discharge areas. We want you to determine TDA delineation for 2 hypothetical projects. You're going to have 10 minutes to complete this exercise. We're going to break everybody up into groups of about 5 to 6 or so. If each group would please nominate one person from your group to lead the report out of results when we get back. When we do come back together and ask you to report out your results, we'll ask you to put those in the chat, and Rebecca will monitor the chat and we'll discuss everybody's results and see how they compare with ours. So before we do the breakout, let me give you a little bit of orientation. So remember, there are two little exercises we're going to do, same objective for both. We want you to determine how many threshold discharge areas the project site would have and which subbasins would be in each of those TDAs. So you see here in this exercise number 1A, you've got subbasins A, B, and C. So you want to determine how many threshold discharge areas there are and which of those subbasins fall under each threshold discharge area, if there are any TDAs for this site. So for this site, number 1A, you've got a total project area of 10 acres. You see in the lower left corner of the slide. It's a residential site and it's outside of the urban area and outside of the urban growth area. In other words, it's a residential area, it's a rural area. For the second exercise, you've got 2 subbasins here, A and B, and you've got a 4-acre project site. It is residential. And it's outside of the urban area and outside of the urban growth area. So with that, Kim, can you help us break out into groups of 5 to 6, and we'll start the clock for 10 minutes for folks to solve these 2 problems. Also remember that Rebecca provided a packet for you, and you'll see this exercise in pages 20, starting on page 26 of your packet. Rebecca also provided you with a link for the online manual and then showed you where the threshold discharge area definition could be found. So you can use both your packet and your online manual as a reference. And we'll see you in about 10 minutes. All right. All right, and everybody's, you're seeing my screen again, I'm gonna assume?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right, welcome back, everybody. So if the designated lead from each of the breakout groups can go ahead and put your answer in the chat for number 1A first. This was the one with 3 subbasins, A, B, and C. And Rebecca, let me know when you get responses in the chat, if you will.
All right, I'm seeing a couple of responses come up. So I see one says 2. Another room says 2 TDAs. So I only got 2 responses, but yeah, two TDAs. A plus B and then C.
Okay. And let's go ahead and request responses now for the second breakout exercise, which was number 1B. We had 2 subbasins in that one.
So for 1B, folks are saying 1.
Is that all the responses?
Yeah, it
we're
looks like
waiting on?
mainly 1, and then 1 says not applicable less than 5 acres. So I'm not sure if that means 1 or 0, but yeah.
Okay, all right. We'll go ahead and compare your answers with ours. So for exercise number 1A, those who said 2 threshold discharge areas were correct. And it's subbasins A and B make up TDA 1, and subbasin C makes up TDA 2. Nice job there. And for exercise number 1B, those who said TDAs are not applicable were accurate. There are no TDAs for this site because the project area is less than 5 acres. So as a reminder, TDAs are applicable for Kitsap County for rural residential projects that are 5 acres or greater. So nice job on that exercise, everyone. Anybody have any questions for us in the chat on that?
Not seeing any questions.
Perfect. All right, well, Rebecca gave us an awesome overview of the key changes in the manual to volume 1. Volume 1 is where we lay out the minimum requirements, applicability, and what is required for those minimum requirements that may apply to your site. Volume 2 is more of where the rubber meets the road in terms of what your submittal requirements are and how to select best management practices if you're required to include them in your project, and how to design those best management practices, etc. So I'm going to go over the volume 2, the key changes in the updated manual. So the key changes include some minor updates to the submittal requirements, which I'll walk through in a moment. We added local amendments for 4 source control BMPs that you see listed here. We clarified which continuous models are allowed to be used for sizing best management practices. We updated infiltration feasibility methods, which we'll walk through in some detail. We updated design criteria for pipes, outfalls, and tightline systems. And we added a couple of new figures and also incorporated figures that were previously online only, but detached from the published manual. Those have now been reincorporated into the manual, and we'll walk through what those are in a moment. All right, so in chapter 1, section 1.2, that's where you'll find information about drainage review processes. There was an update to figure 1.1, which is shown here. And the update is related to TDA, threshold discharge area, or TDA requirements, specifically small TDA projects. So remember, a small project is a project that triggers minimum requirement number 1 through 5 only. So in other words, flow control and water quality treatment and the other minimum requirements do not apply to small projects. For those small projects that are using a TDA approach, you would be using the simplified drainage review engineered drainage review pathway. And for a large project that uses TDA, so a large project is one that triggers all 9 minimum requirements, you'd be going through the full drainage review process. And as a reminder of what those different drainage review pathways are, here's table 1.3. Nothing really changed in terms of the definition of each of these types of drainage review. The only thing that has changed here is, as you see in footnote B, highlighted at the bottom, if a project is implementing a TDA approach, engineered review, or a full drainage review is required, as we just covered in the last slide. But here you can have a reminder of what components are required depending on what type of drainage review you're doing in terms of application forms and the submittal requirements. Section 1.4.4 is where we outline the drainage report requirements, and there were some updates there. Additional requirements were added for projects that are implementing a TDA approach. Specifically, you'll be required, if you choose to do, if you're allowed to do a TDA approach, and if you choose to do a TDA approach, then you'll be required to submit a TDA delineation map, similar to the exercise we just went through. Large projects must tabulate the following for each TDA. You'll have to tabulate the amount of new pollution generating hard surfaces, replaced pollution generating hard surface, effective impervious surfaces, and converted vegetated areas. So now you always had to tabulate these areas, but now if you use a TDA approach, you just have to break that tabulation down by TDA. You also have to do a downstream analysis if you're using a TDA approach. And other technical analyses may be required depending on the site conditions, such as a geotechnical analysis and or a critical drainage area evaluation. In Chapter 3, we added source control BMP for storage of liquid, food waste, or dangerous waste containers. The requirement is to keep the containers inside a building unless it's impracticable due to site constraints or fire code requirements. And containers have to be stored in designated areas which are covered, bermed, and paved. And you'll see the figure to the right is a new figure that should hopefully help with design of these facilities. Section 4.7, downstream analysis requirements. So downstream analysis was always required for projects with SDAP applications that meet any of the criteria listed in the code section listed there, 12.10.060. Always required for large projects and for project sites located in critical drainage areas. The change is that they're also now required for projects that are implementing TDAs. Section 5.3.1, where we describe dispersion feasibility assessment. There was a change made to table 5.2, which is minimum horizontal setback requirements between stormwater BMPs and on-site sewage system components. The change that was made to that table is there was a new column added to the right, which is a horizontal setback requirement from building sewer and non-perforated distribution pipe. It only affects one BMP, which is at the bottom there, the unlined detention pond and infiltration basins. Infiltration basins were added to the table in this update. The second bullet there, the updated setback requirements, is what I just ran through in the table there. We also added clarification that if the Kitsap County Board of Health setbacks are different from those published in the manual, then the Kitsap County Board of Health supersedes what you're finding in the manual. In table 5.3, where we have minimum horizontal setback requirements between stormwater BMPs and private or public wells. So again, the previous table were setbacks from on-site sewage system components. And now we're talking about horizontal setbacks from private or public wells. Infiltration basins were added to this table. And again, we added the clarification that if there's any deviation with Kitsap County Board of Health setbacks, that those Kitsap County Board of Health setbacks will take precedence. In section 5.3.2, we have figure 5.1, which is a flow chart that guides you through the process of determining what you're required to do for infiltration feasibility assessment. And there was a small change to the flow chart, to the notes in the upper right, where we added infiltration BMP setbacks, specifically 100 feet from open water features and designated landslide features, 200 feet from open springs and flowing artesian wells for drinking water supply, and 50 feet from the top of any slope over 20%. Section 5.3.2, this is where you can determine what subsurface investigation is required for your site, what infiltration testing is required for your site, whether you're required to do groundwater monitoring and what type of monitoring you have to do, characterization of infiltration receptor and groundwater mounding and seepage analysis. So this is table 5.4. As I mentioned earlier, there were some updates to the infiltration testing methods that are allowed in this manual update. So specifically, the change made here is that we're now allowing for grain size analysis. That was not previously allowed in the manual. It's now being allowed only in rural residential project sites. A small pilot infiltration test or small pit is no longer allowed for sites with greater than or equal to 1 acre of impervious area being infiltrated. And large pits, deep infiltration tests, and grain size analysis, we've clarified that a licensed professional is required. So we are going to have a breakout exercise on this infiltration testing in just a moment. So heads up there. Table 5.5, minimum measured infiltration rates. We're still in section 5.3.2 here, where we talk about infiltration testing. The update to this table is that for bioretention without underdrain, the minimum allowed measured infiltration rate for meeting flow control, runoff treatment, and LID performance standard, it used to be 0.6 inch per hour. We updated that to 0.3 inches per hour for consistency with all the other BMPs and with the Ecology manual. All right, now we're going to switch gears and talk about updates to the runoff, how you select a runoff treatment BMP. So figure 5.2, runoff treatment BMP selection flowchart. We made updates here just for consistency with the Ecology manual. Specifically, we removed media filter drain from the phosphorus control BMP menu. We clarified the process for considering whether enhanced treatment BMP is required after selecting a phosphorus control BMP. And we added permeable pavement to the listed BMPs for infiltration after pre-treatment. So that's a significant change that that permeable pavement is allowed for runoff treatment BMP. You'll find when you read further in the manual that you'd be required to use a sand layer underneath the permeable pavement if you don't meet your site suitability criteria. You can read further about that in the permeable pavement section of Chapter 5. Chapter 8 is critical drainage areas, and there was an update to the critical drainage area maps. Gamblewood, Edgewater, Miller Bay Estates, and a portion of Manchester were removed from the maps. For Manchester, the removal was associated with the Stormwater Park and the associated upgrades there, which helped alleviate critical drainage areas in that area. Lastly, I want to run through some updates that were made to some of the appendices. So Appendix A is the glossary, and you can see we added several definitions to the glossary. Some definitions that were in there before were revised, and we also added numerous acronyms just for clarification and completeness. Appendix C is the site assessment and planning packet. We made updates just to incorporate threshold discharge area into that packet. So specifically, you'll see a couple of updated in portion D of the packet where you're expected to document existing and proposed site land cover areas, and section E of the packet where you're expected to lay out your potential low impact development BMPs. You'll notice that there's some changes associated with how to do your documentation if you're using TDAs. Appendix F is hydrologic hydraulic modeling methods. And there we added some tables and figures that were previously in the 2010 Stormwater Design Manual. They were not incorporated in the 2016 update, and they've been reincorporated now in this new 2021 update. We added a new figure, which used to be in Chapter 4, that now got moved to this Appendix F, and updated some equation formatting. Appendix G is subsurface investigation and infiltration testing for infiltration BMPs. There's some fairly significant updates there because of the new the changes in the infiltration methods that we just ran through. So there's some updated terminology and references. We added underground injection control, or UIC, well language for consistency with the Ecology manual. Updated procedural guidelines to try to clarify them and make them easier to use. And again, we added grain size analysis for consistency with the Ecology manual. Appendix H is LID infeasibility criteria. So the infeasibility criteria were updated for consistency with the Ecology manual. Primarily, this relates to dispersion BMPs. We added new infeasibility criteria for perforated stub out pipe connections. And we removed infeasibility criteria for permeable pavement because they were very extensive and they were duplicative of the Ecology manual. And so now we are just referencing the Ecology manual. All right, and so this brings us to our second and our last breakout exercise for the day. So in this exercise, the objective is going to be to identify which infiltration testing methods you would be allowed to use for 4 hypothetical project sites. Again, we're going to take about 10 minutes to complete this, and we're going to do this in breakout groups again. You'll designate a lead for each group, just like we did before, and put your responses for all 4 exercises in the chat when we return. And you can turn to slides 52 to 54 in your packet. And again, you can also use the online manual to help guide you. So the 4 exercises is very simple. They're all shown in this one table. And again, what you're trying to do is determine the infiltration testing requirements for the following project sites, 2A through 2D. First one is a rural residential site, adding 1,500 square feet of impervious area. Number 2B is non-rural residential, adding the same 1,500 square feet of impervious area. Next is the rural residential site, adding 20,000 square feet. And then finally, a non-rural residential site, adding 20,000 square feet of impervious area. So here, what we want you to do is we want you to get familiar with the new tables that help you to define which infiltration testing methods would be allowed. And we also want you to have an opportunity to dig into the online manual and start to see some of the enhanced search functionality. So as you try to solve this exercise, we wanted you to try 2 different techniques. First, search for the term minimum investigation and see what you find. And then search the term subsurface investigation with a filter on for volume 2, chapter 5. So you can see how significantly different, more focused the search results become when you use filters and when you use subtle changes in words. You'll also notice, unlike when you search in a PDF that simply brings you to each instance in series, when you're using the online manual, when you do a search, it'll bring all of the results up to you on one page, similar to like a Google search, and it'll provide context. So it makes it much simpler for you to determine which result is the most valuable. So you can really find the information you're looking for a lot faster. So with that said, we'll go ahead, Kim, if you will help us to break out into groups of 5 or 6 again, and we'll meet back here in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back, everybody. Oops. I almost just revealed the answers. Can we have everybody please first put your answer for project 2A in the chat? Again, that was the rural residential site with 1,500 square feet impervious area added.
All right, looks like responses are coming in. We've got one for 2A for simple infiltration test, one for simple infiltration test or grain analysis. And I only got 2 responses so far.
All right, let's go ahead and put responses in for number 2B, non-rural residential, 1,500 square feet.
2B, we've got one response that says standard, another that says small pilot, another that says grain size.
Good mix. And number 2C then, rural residential, 20,000 square feet impervious area added.
One more vote for small pit for 2B.
Excellent.
Let's see, no responses for 2C. Oh, here we go. 2C comprehensive. 2C small pit or grain size, small pilot, small pit or grain.
We're ready for 2D. Let's go ahead and add your responses for 2D, which is non-rural residential, 20,000 square feet impervious area added.
All right, 2D, I see one for comprehensive, one for small pit, one for small pilot. And
All right.
That looks like it. Yep.
Love the diversity. All right. Well, hopefully you found your answer in table 2-5.4, which we'll look at in just a minute. The answers we came up with for 2A, simple infiltration test or grain size analysis. For 2B, simple infiltration test only. For 2C, small pilot infiltration test or grain size analysis. And for 2D, a small pit only. Let's take a look at why that's the case. All right, so we're looking at the column step 3 for infiltration testing methods. And if the impervious area infiltrated on the project site is less than 2,000 square feet, and there's also notes that we're going to need to look at, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. But you'll see that under step 3 infiltration testing, you're allowed to use simple infiltration test as long as note B applies, or the grain size analysis as long as notes C and D apply. And we'll read those notes in a moment. The other relevant information here is for project sites with greater than or equal to 10,000, with between 10,000 square feet and an acre of impervious area infiltrated on the project site, you would be allowed to use the small pit if note D applies, or grain size analysis if notes C or D apply. So let's take a look at those notes. Now, there was text, before you got to this table that laid out all this logic, but we're coming to this table for the summary of it all. So note B says that the simple infiltration test is not allowed for projects with no offsite point of discharge. It's only allowed for project sites located in rural areas, meaning outside the urban growth area and the urban area, with the drainage area limitations that were listed in the table that we just reviewed. The small pit or the large pit shall be used where the simple infiltration test is not applicable or not allowed. Grain size analysis is allowed for rural residential project sites and can only be used if the site has soils that are unconsolidated by glacial advance. You can refer to the Ecology manual for additional guidance. And the investigation and infiltration testing report shall be prepared by a licensed professional. Let's also review note G, which was applicable to solving these problems. A single BMP is defined as a BMP that has at least 10 foot of separation distance from another infiltrating BMP, measured from the closest vertical extent of the maximum ponding before overflow or for bioretention and rain gardens. the maximum vertical extent of the top of the bioretention soil or compost amended soil. All right, so do folks have questions about how we came to these answers and reviewing those tables? Any, oh, I see there is a hand raised. Jason, I'm not seeing the chat, so is there anything in the chat, Rebecca? Or
There's a separate question in the chat, but Jason, if you want to either unmute or type your question in the chat, we can take a look at that.
Well, my question is your response for 2B, simple infiltration test. Since 2B is non-rural, wouldn't footnote B apply to that?
The symbol is not allowed for project sites with no offsite point of discharge, is only allowed for project sites located in rural areas. Oh.
You know what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. 2B is non-rural. And so yeah, do we need to issue a correction on that, Rebecca?
That may be an error. Yeah, I'm reading the note because right now it says the simple infiltration test is only allowed for project sites located in rural areas, but I believe that should say the grain size analysis is only allowed. Is that correct, Robin? Or wait, the next note is grain size analysis is allowed for rural. Okay. Yeah, that is confusing. We'll take a look at that.
Yeah, let us take a look at that and issue some clarification if we need to.
Thanks
Thank
for pointing
you for that
out.
question. It's an important one.
Robin, there's one other question that came up in the chat. If you flip back one slide. So not related to this exercise, but there was a question about, will the well monitoring really be required for each infiltration facility for single family residential on an individual lot as stated in table 2-5.4. So I believe that's related to step 5, groundwater monitoring there, which we didn't highlight in this exercise, but the question's asking if well monitoring is required for single family residential.
So step 5, groundwater monitoring.
So there's the minimum number of wells there,
Yeah,
1 and
so
3.
if you've got 5,000 square, 5 to 10,000 square feet of impervious area infiltrated on the project site, you would need 1 well. And if you've got more than 10,000 square feet, you would need a minimum of 3 wells. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. I didn't see any footnotes related to whether that would be required for single family residential or not, but I think that's the question, depending on the project size, is that really going to be required
So,
for those projects?
Yeah, okay. So let's take a look at note I. For projects where runoff from 5,000 square feet or more of impervious surface area will be infiltrated on the site, infiltration within 500 feet up gradient or 100 feet down gradient of a contaminated site or landfill requires analysis and approval by a licensed hydrogeologist. So yeah, looking at the information summarized in this table, there'd be no exception for a single family residential. Does that answer the question? And do we have any other questions before we move on?
There is a question earlier in the chat that asks, what platform did you use to create this online manual?
We used a software called Flare. Madcap is the provider, Madcap Flare, and it's the same software that Ecology used for the 2019 Ecology manual update. Yeah, we will. So you'll be able to use the manual online. You'll also be able to print a PDF from the online version. And you'll see that from the online version, you can also download figures and CAD files. You can also use a traditional PDF if you preferred. All right. Well, that actually concludes our summary of the key changes in the manual in our 2 breakout exercises. So we wanted to leave a little bit of time for discussion or any other questions that folks may have. Anybody want to raise your hand or throw anything in the chat in this moment?